I stared up at the ceiling of the emergency room, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering in a rhythm that felt almost personal, as if they were timing the slow rise and fall of my breath. The beeping of the cardiac monitor echoed through the sterile space, steady yet unsettling, a reminder that my body was still here, even if my mind was barely holding on. Cold air drifted across my skin, brushing over the bruises on my ribs, and the tender pulse at my shoulder where the fall had rattled my entire frame. A nurse passed by the doorway, pushing a cart of supplies, and not even glancing in because I was just another patient in another curtained-off room on another forgettable night. The curtain swayed slightly behind her, and for a moment I felt swallowed by that small square of isolation. I heard the doctor's voice before I saw him. He approached with calm footsteps and a clipboard pressed against his chest. He looked kind, too kind for the darkness clinging to me like a second skin. He asked if there was anyone he could call, someone who could come sit with me or pick me up later. I swallowed hard. The truth tasted metallic. No, no one. The word left my mouth so softly it almost disappeared into the mechanical hum of the ER. He nodded with a sympathy that somehow made everything worse and stepped out, leaving me alone with the sound of my own breathing and the throbbing ache blooming under my bruises. My phone vibrated on the metal tray beside me loud against the quiet, and for a moment I considered not touching it at all. I did not have the strength for more disappointment. But the vibration continued insistent. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the phone closer. The screen lit up with a video notification from my family group chat. It took only a second for the image to load, but in that second I felt the world tilt again. The video opened to a brightly lit steakhouse, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses mixing with upbeat dinner music. My brother Daniel stood at the center of the frame, holding a celebratory cocktail while everyone around him cheered. My mother lifted her glass toward the camera, her smile wide and proud. Brittany leaned into the shot perfectly, posed her manicured hand resting on Daniel's chest as she shouted something about how he deserved the world. The entire family was there, except me. They were celebrating his new contract, the one they had been talking about for weeks, the one they insisted was the beginning of Daniel's great legacy. I watched them laugh, watched them toast, watched them bask in the glow of his moment, and none of them had even asked where I was. None of them had texted. None had called. I stared at the screen as the camera panned across the table, showing glossy menus, full wine glasses, plates piled high with food. My mother's voice rose above the chatter, crisp and impatient, saying the words that had cut me earlier that evening. "Do not ruin tonight for your brother." My chest tightened. The video shifted as someone else held the phone and Daniel's face came into view again. He shouted the accusation that had been ringing in my ears since before the fall. "You always make things about you!" The sound triggered the memory like a switch. The wooden edge of the table slamming into my side. The cracking sound I still could not pinpoint. The spin of the room. The cold floor against my cheek. Their footsteps walking past me on their way out the door. My fingers tightened around the phone, and for a moment I thought I might drop it from the shaking. The cardiac monitor beside me beeped faster, its rhythm shifting with the pace of my breath. I looked at the monitor's green pulse moving across the screen in its steady pattern. Beep, beep, beep. It felt cruel that something so consistent existed when everything inside me was unraveling. I breathed in slowly, the air scraping against the soreness in my ribs. The video on my phone looped again, automatically replaying the celebration, their laughter, their joy, their complete indifference to the fact that I had not shown up at all. They did not notice I was gone. Or maybe they noticed, and simply did not care. The bruises on my arms and the ache in my back pulsed with the memory of the push the fall the moment my family looked down at me and decided their evening mattered more than whether I could stand up again. A sudden wave of nausea rolled through me and I closed my eyes, letting the darkness settle for a moment. I whispered into the quiet of the ER more to myself than to any god or universe or force that might listen. While they celebrated Daniel's success, I lay bruised and alone. Then I said the truth I had never dared to say aloud, exactly the way they wanted. I grew up in a house where silence was treated like obedience, and obedience was treated like love, though neither ever felt anything like the real thing. From as early as I can remember, everything in the Ellison household revolved around image reputation and the golden glow that surrounded my older brother Daniel. My mother used to say that Daniel was born with a star hanging over his crib, blessed and destined for greatness, and she repeated it so often that she eventually believed it more than she believed anything else. My father, before he left, played along with the idea, puffing Daniel up with praise for even the smallest achievement. When he eventually walked out and never looked back, the narrative shifted. Daniel had to be the legacy, the proof that our family was not falling apart, even though it already had. And I became the shadow that existed behind him. I was the quiet one, the girl who preferred sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with headphones on, listening to recordings of thunderstorms or old vinyl rather than performing for the guests my mother adored parading through our home. She called me difficult. She called me withdrawn. She told people I needed to be encouraged to be more like Daniel, who could charm a room with a single smile. What she refused to understand was that I did not want to charm a room. I just wanted to breathe inside one. Daniel struggled through school, but it never mattered. Every failure was spun into a story about potential waiting to bloom, a setback that would make his future victory all the more impressive. Meanwhile, anything I did well was ignored or brushed aside. When I won a statewide audio production contest in high school, my mother looked at the certificate, smiled politely, and set it under a stack of mail before telling me to go help Daniel with his college applications. He never filled them out, and it was never spoken about again. When I turned 17, I got my first job at the Old Mariners Theater downtown, a creaking century-old building with water-stained ceilings and velvet curtains that always smelled faintly of dust and history. I swept floors at first and learned the layout of the building by heart, from the backstage passages to the lighting loft, but it was the sound booth that felt like a second home. I would stand behind the mixing console and feel the hum of the speakers vibrate through the soles of my shoes, listening to how each voice echoed across the empty seats. The more I learned, the more the crew trusted me, and soon I was running cues during rehearsals, adjusting microphones, and doing small repairs on cables that refused to behave. That job changed me. It gave me an identity that was not tied to my family's expectations. It gave me a voice, even if it came through the speakers rather than my own mouth. But at home, none of that mattered. My mother only cared that I was not around enough to cater to her needs or Daniel's moods. She used to say I was hiding behind my equipment, avoiding real life, avoiding the responsibility of being a good daughter. She never once came to see the plays I worked on. She never asked why I loved sound engineering or what it meant to me. All she knew was that Daniel was not doing well, and I was not supporting him the way she believed a sister should. That resentment simmered for years. When Daniel married Brittany, things got worse. Brittany was the perfect match for my mother, polished and practiced someone who learned within minutes how to present herself as the doting wife and immaculate hostess. She was a natural performer, and my mother adored her instantly. They bonded over decor charity events and complaining about anyone who did not live up to their standards. I was often the subject of those conversations even when I sat in the same room. They did not whisper. They did not lower their voices. They simply pretended I was not there, or worse, that my presence was an inconvenience. Daniel struggled to keep jobs even after the wedding, drifting from one short-term contract to another, but Brittany never blamed him. She blamed stress. She blamed market conditions. She blamed his co-workers. She blamed me once, telling my mother that Daniel could not focus on his next big opportunity because I kept bringing negativity into the house. That negativity, according to her, meant making myself small in the corner and avoiding their questions about why I refused to be more cheerful. My mother believed every word praising Brittany for being supportive and insisting that I learn from her example. The more Brittany charmed, the more invisible I became. I tried distancing myself from them when I could, pouring myself into work at the theater. The long nights of adjusting monitors and tuning microphones felt like the closest thing to safety I had. The theater crew treated me like a human being. They asked me about my day. They thanked me for my help. They did not demand I prove my worth every time I walked into a room. But no matter how much time I spent away, there was always a tether pulling me back into that house, into the expectations that had been carved into me since childhood. I tried to convince myself that if I were patient enough, quiet enough, useful enough, maybe things would eventually change. Maybe one day my mother would see me. Maybe one day Daniel would realize I had never wanted to compete with him. Maybe one day I would belong. But those hopes were fragile, paper-thin fantasies that disintegrated every time my mother dismissed my achievements with a wave of her hand, or Brittany eyed me with that polite smile that did not reach her eyes. I lived in a household where the golden child could do no wrong, where the daughter who did everything right was considered a burden, where my voice was a faint echo swallowed by the louder demands of everyone else. I learned early how to keep my head down, how to avoid conflict, how to stay unnoticed to survive. What I did not know was how much that training would cost me, or how sharply those old dynamics would snap back into place the moment I stepped into that house to care for my mother after her surgery. I had no idea that the child who was never heard was about to become the woman no one cared to see, even as she lay on the floor, unable to stand. When my mother called to tell me she would be having knee replacement surgery and needed someone to stay with her for a few days, I hesitated before answering. The request was simple enough on the surface, something any daughter might do without thinking twice, but nothing in my family was ever simple. I could already feel the weight of unspoken expectations pressing behind her words. She did not ask how my work schedule looked or whether I had the time or energy for it. She assumed I would drop everything. She always did. After a long pause, I told her yes, because saying no had never been an option in our family. The next morning, I arranged 10 days off from the theater. Everyone there was supportive, reminding me that family emergencies came first. Their kindness made the knot in my chest tighten because I knew the moment I walked into my mother's house that kindness would vanish like fog under sunlight. I arrived 2 days after the surgery carrying groceries and my overnight bag ready to help the way any normal daughter would. The house smelled like disinfectant and stale perfume, a combination that settled in my throat. My mother was propped up on the couch with pillows arranged around her like a throne. Brittany stood nearby, holding a mug of tea perfectly styled, even in leggings and a loose sweater, as if she had stepped out of a lifestyle blog rather than a real home where someone was recovering. Daniel paced the kitchen, complaining loudly about contractors who had mismeasured something at work. He did not look at me when I entered. Brittany looked me up and down with mild curiosity, her eyes glinting with something sharp beneath her polite smile. "You made it," she said, as if this were a social event and not me showing up to take care of my own mother. My mother did not greet me with warmth. She simply gestured toward the kitchen and said that she needed her medication sorted out, her lunch prepared, and the guest room sheets changed. Then she told me to take my shoes off so I would not ruin the floor she had just had polished. I set my bags down and did what she asked. That was how the first cracks formed, quiet and almost invisible, but I felt them. The hours stretched long that first day. I fetched water, adjusted pillows, reheated soup, folded blankets, and cleaned the kitchen 3 times. My mother rarely thanked me. Brittany stayed close to her, making small comments that sounded innocent but carried pointed edges. She mentioned how stressed Daniel had been lately, how exhausted she was from supporting him, how the whole family needed positive energy right now. Daniel chimed in from the hallway, saying I seemed tense, and he hoped I would not bring drama into the house during his big week. I swallowed their words like bitter seeds, knowing they would grow into something worse. By the 3rd day, my mother seemed to forget that I was there to help her recover. Instead, she treated me as though I were an unwelcome guest who needed to earn her place. If I sat down for 5 minutes, she would call out asking why I was resting when there were dishes in the sink. If I stepped outside for air, she would ask Brittany loudly whether she thought I had run off again. On the 4th day, Brittany began wearing her wedding set more prominently than usual. At first, I did not think anything of it, but that changed quickly. She appeared at the doorway of the guest room around noon, her expression tight and performative. "Have you seen my ring?" she asked in a tone that was far too calm to be real. "It was on the counter earlier." Daniel walked in just as she said it, and his eyes immediately flicked to me. I told them I had not seen anything. Brittany sighed dramatically and said she hoped it did not get accidentally thrown out or misplaced since there had been so much movement in the house lately. Daniel crossed his arms and stared at me with suspicion that felt like a physical shove. "So you did not touch it," he said as if daring me to lie. No, I repeated, feeling the shift in the room like the pressure change before a storm. They exchanged a glance that told me everything. The seed of doubt had already been planted. Throughout the afternoon, Brittany kept muttering about sentimental value and how devastated she would be if the ring were really gone. My mother, hearing this from the couch, narrowed her eyes at me and asked if I remembered what happened to Daniel's watch years ago. I remembered that watch. I remembered how Daniel had left it on a picnic table at the lake, how I had tried to tell them that he forgot it, how no one believed me. That memory twisted like a knife. By evening, the tension had thickened into something impossible to ignore. My mother insisted I recheck every room. Brittany hovered behind me, sighing meaningfully. Daniel followed silently, arms crossed, eyes sharp with accusation. I felt cornered, trapped in a house that once felt too big, but now seemed to shrink with every step they took behind me. Later that night in the kitchen, Daniel leaned against the counter while Brittany stood beside him. He looked at me like I was a stranger. "You need to be honest with us," he said. "If you misplaced the ring, say so." I told him again that I had never touched it. Brittany gasped as if wounded and whispered that she just wanted to trust family. The implication hung in the air. My mother called from the living room saying that this was exactly the kind of chaos she could not handle right now. I felt my breath catch in my chest. I murmured that I had done nothing wrong. Daniel scoffed and said I always played the victim. Those words cracked something deep inside me. After years of doing everything right, years of walking on glass to avoid upsetting anyone, I was still the enemy in their narrative. That night alone in the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the muffled voices in the hallway. Brittany said she did not feel safe leaving her jewelry around me. My mother said she had warned them that my job in the theater was isolating me from reality. Daniel said this week was too important to deal with my issues. Their words wrapped around me like a vice, squeezing tighter with every breath. The cracks that had formed during childhood were widening now, turning into fractures that threatened to split open everything I had worked so hard to hold together. And I still had 6 more days under that roof. 6 more days before the fractures became something irreversible. By the 5th morning, the energy in the house had shifted into something toxic enough that I could feel it the moment I stepped out of the guest room. The hallway air was thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Brittany stood at the kitchen counter, stirring her coffee with the kind of exaggerated calm that only angry people perform. Daniel scrolled through his phone with a clenched jaw, and my mother lay on the couch with her blanket pulled up dramatically, sighing every few seconds loud enough to announce her martyrdom. No one said good morning. I had learned long ago that silence in this family was rarely peaceful. It was preparation. I started unloading the dishwasher because the kitchen looked like no one else had touched a dish in 2 days. My mother called out from the living room asking why the laundry had not been moved yet. I told her I planned to do it next. She replied that she would have thought I'd handle simple tasks faster, considering I was not working this week. Brittany added quietly that she hoped everyone was doing their part to make things smooth for Daniel, what with his major presentation coming up. Her words dripped with passive accusation, and I felt heat gather in my chest. Every chore seemed to multiply. If I wiped the counters, she asked why I had not swept. If I brought my mother soup, she complained the broth tasted different than yesterday. If I folded laundry, she inspected the towels as if I were applying for a housekeeping job. The ring incident had settled over the house like invisible dust, coating every interaction, every glance, every breath. Later that afternoon, I caught Brittany standing in the hallway outside the guest room, holding a small stack of my folded shirts. She said she found them on the wrong shelf and did not want anything out of place. Her smile was tight, polite, and entirely false. I thanked her and took the clothes, but the way she eyed the room behind me made my stomach churn, as if she thought I had hidden something there, as if she expected guilt to seep through the walls. Daniel came home earlier than expected that evening, slamming the front door so hard the picture frames rattled. My mother flinched and called for him, but he brushed past her irritation and stormed toward me. He said the contractors from work messed up a project, and now everything might be delayed, and he could not handle more problems right now. He said it like I was the problem waiting for him at home. I stayed quiet because any words that came out of my mouth were bound to be twisted into something else. Brittany approached him delicately, resting a hand on his arm as if soothing a wounded animal. She whispered that he needed to stay focused and not let anyone drag his mood down. Her eyes flicked briefly to me. The message was clear. As the week dragged on, my body began to feel the strain. I was waking up before dawn to prepare breakfast and staying up late doing dishes. My mother refused to take her medication from anyone except me, calling my name constantly even when Brittany or Daniel were in the same room. She claimed no one else understood her pain or took her recovery seriously. Yet whenever she talked to Daniel, she complained that I did not do enough. One evening, while vacuuming the living room, I overheard my mother whispering to Brittany that I was always a difficult child and that she regretted indulging me instead of pushing me to be more like Daniel. Brittany hummed sympathetically and said some people simply lacked discipline. I turned off the vacuum before they realized I was there and walked to the kitchen, blinking hard to clear the sting in my eyes. I stood at the sink, gripping the edge of the counter, inhaling deeply because I knew if I cried, they would call it theatrics. A soft tapping on the counter startled me. It was Brittany's ring finger tapping the granite bear, except for her wedding band. She asked if I had found the missing ring yet, using a tone that implied I should have confessed by now. I told her calmly that I had not touched it. She leaned closer, her perfume thick and floral. "Some people lie so often they start believing themselves," she said. Daniel walked in just in time to hear her last sentence. He stared at me with disappointment painted across his face as though he had discovered a truth about me that had been waiting beneath the surface for years. My throat tightened, but I stayed silent. Anything I said would be used against me. That night, sitting in the dim guest room with the door cracked open, I listened to them talk about me. They thought I was asleep. Daniel said he could not trust me anymore and that having me in the house was only making things worse. My mother complained that the tension was delaying her healing and putting unnecessary stress on her. Brittany laughed softly and said, "Maybe I needed professional help." I pressed my fist to my mouth to keep from making a sound. The thing about emotional unraveling is that it does not happen all at once. It starts slowly, like a stitch loosening on the hem of a shirt. A tug here, a strain there, until one day the entire seam has come undone, and you are standing in front of the mirror, holding pieces you no longer know how to repair. By the sixth day, the tension had grown so sharp that every conversation felt like stepping onto thin ice. That morning, my mother accused me of moving her medication, even though it sat exactly where I had placed it the night before. When I pointed to it on the side table, she rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic. She accused me of changing the house routine and making everything harder for her. She even questioned whether I had come to help at all, or whether I wanted to stay for free food and lodging. I felt something inside me crack, but I swallowed the pain and kept going. That afternoon, while helping her shift positions on the couch, she winced as if I had hurt her intentionally. She pulled her arm away and told Brittany that I was careless and unpredictable. Brittany put on an expression of deep concern and nodded sympathetically. Daniel told me later that I needed to control my temper because my mother was vulnerable right now. My temper. I had not raised my voice once. I had not argued. I had barely spoken unless spoken to. Yet somehow I was the one with the temper. Somehow I was the threat. The unraveling became complete the night Daniel announced a major dinner with potential business partners to celebrate his upcoming contract. He said the family needed to be at their best. He said my energy was too heavy and that I should make myself scarce. My mother agreed. Brittany added that I should not bring up the ring situation because it would ruin the evening. I stared at them, realizing I could spend every minute of my life trying to prove myself to these people, and it would never matter. I would always be the problem. I would always be the disappointment. I would always be the daughter unheard. And in that moment, standing in the dimly lit kitchen with the sound of simmering sauce on the stove and the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, I felt something shift inside me. The cracks were no longer cracks. They were fractures, and something inside those fractures was beginning to break free. The night everything finally broke open did not arrive with warning or drama. It slipped in quietly, disguised as an ordinary evening, the kind where the house lights felt too bright, and every shadow seemed to carry the weight of unspoken resentment. I had spent most of the day shuttling between the kitchen and living room, adjusting my mother's pillows, reheating her soup, and cleaning up after everyone as if my existence depended on how spotless I kept the counters. By sundown, my legs ached, my head throbbed, and my nerves felt stretched so tight that even the soft buzz of the refrigerator made my jaw clench. Daniel came home late, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and the confidence he always wore when things went well for him. He dropped his keys on the table with a clatter that echoed through the space. Brittany hurried to him with a smile that felt rehearsed, pressing a kiss to his cheek as if they were actors performing a scene for an invisible audience. My mother straightened up on the couch and asked how the meeting had gone. Daniel launched into a story about his contract, about the money, the momentum, the opportunity he deserved. My mother practically glowed. She praised him, congratulated him, told him he was finally stepping into the greatness she always knew he had. Listening to them, I felt more distant than ever, standing in the doorway with a dish towel still in my hand, invisible as always. Then Brittany asked the question that shifted the entire night into a different direction. "Should we have a family meeting before the dinner celebration tomorrow?" she said. And just like that, the mood changed. Daniel fired a quick look at me, then nodded. My stomach tightened. Family meeting in this house never meant resolution. It meant accusation disguised as concern. It meant a verdict had already been decided and they wanted an audience to witness it. They gathered around the living room, positioning themselves in a semicircle with me standing across from them like a defendant awaiting trial. The lights overhead cast sharp reflections on the polished floor, making the room feel colder somehow. My mother adjusted her blanket, cleared her throat, and announced that a certain issue needed to be handled before they could move on with their lives. Brittany folded her hands over her lap and lowered her gaze as if preparing to deliver bad news. Daniel exhaled loudly, his shoulders squared in self-righteous frustration. My mother began by talking about her fragile state, how stress affected her recovery, how she needed everything calm and controlled in the house. She said the ring situation had gone unresolved for too long. She said she felt disrespected by the atmosphere of distrust that I had created. I blinked, stunned. I had created. Before I could respond, Daniel spoke. He asked me again if I had taken the ring, his tone firm and accusing. I told him no. The word came out steady but quiet, as if it were trying to protect itself from the impact of their disbelief. Brittany inhaled with a shaky sigh, the kind someone gives when they want sympathy. She said she did not want to blame anyone, but the ring had sentimental value. She even told a small story about how Daniel had given it to her during a difficult moment in their relationship, turning the missing jewelry into a symbol of their love. It was masterful manipulation. Their eyes turned to me with renewed suspicion. I repeated what I had said from the beginning. I never touched your ring. Not once. Daniel snorted. He said that I had always been resentful of his success, that I had always needed attention, that I had chosen the worst week possible to start causing problems. My chest tightened, but I stayed composed. Brittany leaned closer to my mother and whispered something that looked like concern but sounded like calculation. My mother nodded slowly, her expression becoming more stern, more certain. She looked at me and said that this family had put up with my moods for long enough that I needed to stop creating chaos every time something important happened for Daniel. Her voice rose slightly as she continued, saying that I had been acting suspicious, hiding in the guest room, distracting everyone from what really mattered. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, distracting everyone. My existence had become an inconvenience so large that they needed to rewrite reality just to avoid facing their own cruelty. I tried explaining again, pointing out that I had spent every hour of the past week taking care of her. I reminded them that I had cooked meals, washed laundry, cleaned rooms, and tended to every need without complaint. My mother interrupted sharply and said that doing chores was not a character witness. She claimed that manipulative people could be helpful when they wanted something. The words landed like claws dragging across my skin. I looked at Daniel, hoping for even the smallest sliver of recognition, but his face was a wall. He told me to confess so they could move on. I told him there was nothing to confess. His jaw clenched. He stepped closer. Brittany gasped as if sensing a storm breaking. My mother said my name with warning in her voice. And then Daniel snapped. It happened fast, so fast I barely had time to react. He raised his hand in frustration not to hit me, but to emphasize his anger, and in the process, he shoved me aside as he turned. His arm collided with my shoulder just as my heel caught on the edge of the rug. The world spun. My back slammed into the wooden table. The impact shot agony up my spine and across my ribs. I gasped as the room tilted violently. My vision blurred. I slid down onto the floor, the air knocked clean out of my lungs. I lay there for a moment, unable to breathe, my heartbeat, a frantic flutter in my ears. My limbs trembled as I tried to gather myself. I could hear Brittany whispering urgently, hear Daniel cursing under his breath, hear my mother scoffing as if I were performing a rehearsed scene. Daniel leaned over me and told me to stop being dramatic. He said I did this on purpose. He said I needed to grow up. My mother told him to leave me. She said she would not let my theatrics ruin Daniel's big night. Those words sliced deeper than the fall. They stood above me, silhouettes against the warm living room lights, and not one of them reached out a hand. They did not ask if I was hurt. They did not apologize. They did not pause. My mother waved dismissively and told Daniel and Brittany to get ready because they were going to dinner. She reminded them that their reservation was in half an hour and that important people would be there. Daniel stepped back and straightened his shirt, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves. Brittany adjusted her hair in the hallway mirror. My mother grabbed her purse and called out instructions for me to lock up before heading to bed. And then they walked around me. They walked past me. They stepped over me. My vision pulsed. My breath came shallow. Every nerve in my body screamed not from the physical pain, but from the truth hitting me with full force. I was not a daughter in their eyes. I was a burden, a nuisance, a distraction from their celebration. When the door finally closed behind them, the house fell silent, except for my uneven breaths and the faint ringing in my ears. I tried to push myself up, but the movement sent a sharp bolt of pain through my rib cage. My fingers clawed at the floor for support. The room wavered above me in soft ripples of light. I whispered for help, barely audible even to myself. But there was no one to hear it. No one left in that house cared whether I could stand. They did not care whether I could breathe. And so the night of the fallout did not end with shouting or apology or understanding. It ended with a quiet front door closing and the sound of their laughter fading into the distance as I lay alone on the floor, struggling to rise. The moment the front door clicked shut behind them, the silence in the house settled like a heavy sheet of ice across my chest. For a long time, I simply lay there on the floor, staring at the ceiling through the blur of pain and disbelief, trying to convince myself that what had just happened was real. My ribs throbbed with every breath, sharp flashes of heat spreading from my side to my back. My shoulder ached where it had struck the edge of the table, and my limbs felt disconnected, slow, and unresponsive. I lifted my hand a few inches off the floor and immediately let it drop again when a wave of dizziness rolled through me. I was alone. Truly, terrifyingly alone. I tried speaking just to hear my own voice to anchor myself to the moment. The only sound that came out was a thin, broken whisper that dissolved into the stillness. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to simply exist in that fragile state, too stunned to move, too hurt to think. Then the cold began to seep into my bones, urging action. I braced my palms against the hardwood, each movement sending sparks of pain through my arms. I pushed up a few inches before my strength faltered, and I collapsed again. Tears burned behind my eyes, not from the physical agony, but from the raw truth that had finally become impossible to ignore. They had left me on the floor like an unwanted object, left me without hesitation, without concern, without even the courtesy to check if I was conscious. Their laughter still seemed to echo faintly in my ears, a cruel ghost of joy against the sound of my strained breathing. I turned my head toward the hallway, the path that suddenly looked miles long despite being only a few steps away. I needed to get out. I needed air. I needed help. The room wavered as I rolled onto my side and pulled my knees beneath me. The shift sent a stabbing pain up my ribs, forcing a gasp from my throat. My fingers curled around the edge of the table leg, and I used it as leverage, dragging myself forward inch by inch. The floor beneath me was cold but steady, the only solid thing in a world that felt like it was tilting dangerously. My phone was in the kitchen. I had to get to it. I reached the base of the table and paused, letting the dizziness wash over me. My breaths came shallow and fast, my heart pounding erratically in my ears. I pressed my palm to my ribs, wincing as the bruising flared like a struck match. I swallowed hard, tasting copper at the back of my throat. I whispered again, barely audible, telling myself to keep going. When I finally managed to crawl into the dining room, the light overhead flickered as if mocking my struggle. I dragged my hand across the wall, searching for stability. Each time my body shifted, pressure pulsed against my ribs in sharp bursts that made my vision narrow. The kitchen felt impossibly far, the tile floor glowing faintly under the overhead light. I inched forward, my knees scraping painfully against the wood. Sweat gathered at my temples and slid down my cheeks, mixing with the stray tears I refused to acknowledge. When I reached the threshold of the kitchen, I stopped and leaned my forehead against the cool door frame. My breath shook. My ribs felt like they were being squeezed from the inside. I blinked through the haze, willing my eyes to focus. My phone sat on the counter, its black screen reflecting the kitchen light. I reached out and gripped the lower cabinet handle, pulling myself to my knees. The movement sent white-hot pain shooting across my side, forcing a choked cry from my throat. My legs trembled beneath me. I pushed again, my arms doing most of the work until I was able to reach the counter's edge. My fingers fumbled against the cold laminate, and I pulled myself upward, inch by inch, my jaw clenched so tightly I felt a pop near my temple. When I was finally upright enough to reach the phone, I grabbed it and nearly dropped it immediately. My hands were shaking too badly. The screen lit up when I pressed the side button, 2% battery remaining. My stomach dropped. I opened the dial pad and pressed 9, then 1, then 1. The phone rang once before the signal dropped. No service. A weak bar flickered and vanished. The house was in a semi-rural area with patchy coverage, and I was too far from the window. My breath grew sharper, tinged with panic. I tried texting the only friend I trusted. The message failed to send. My vision blurred as I stared at the mocking red exclamation mark next to the unsent text. I could not call for help from here. I had to get outside. The cold air might help. The higher ground near the backyard fence sometimes caught better signal. I turned toward the back door, gripping the counter for balance. My legs wobbled as I shuffled forward. Each step felt unstable, as if the floor were swaying under me. When I reached the sliding glass door, my fingers fumbled with the lock. I managed to unlatch it and pushed the door open with my shoulder. A rush of cold night air hit me full in the face. The temperature chilled my skin and tightened my breath, but it also brought clarity. I stepped onto the porch, gripping the railing for balance. The night was quiet except for the soft chirp of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. The backyard stretched out in a shadowy blur, the grass dark and glistening with dew. I inhaled the cold air and tried calling again. The phone gave the same result. 1 bar, then none, then 1, then none. I brought the phone closer to my chest as if holding it tighter would force it to work. The battery icon blinked, the screen dimmed slightly, my breath hitched. I stepped down onto the grass, the cold seeping through my socks. My body wavered with each movement, but I kept going. The security light on the side of the house flicked on flooding part of the yard with a harsh yellow glow. My shadow stretched long across the lawn. I walked toward the fence, each step jarring my ribs, sending small pulses of agony through my shoulders and back. I raised the phone again, staring desperately at the shifting bars. 1 bar appeared. I pressed call. The screen froze for 2 seconds before flashing the same message. Call failed. The phone vibrated weakly in my hand as the battery dropped to 1%. A surge of despair washed through me. I stood there breathing hard, feeling the weight of the night settle on my shoulders. The cold began to sink into my skin until I shivered uncontrollably. My vision pulsed. I staggered toward the nearest fence post, leaning heavily against it. For a moment, I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. Then a light flicked on from the house next door. A motion sensor. Footsteps followed, slow and careful. Someone opened the back door with a creak that cut through the quiet. "You all right out there?" A voice called deep and weathered with age. I opened my eyes and turned my head, barely able to make out the silhouette of Mr. Dawson, the elderly man who lived behind my mother. He stepped closer, squinting at me as the porch light illuminated his concerned face. "Nora, is that you?" he asked, his voice filled with alarm. I tried answering, but the word caught in my throat and dissolved into a strained whisper. He hurried down the steps and reached my side just as my knees buckled. "Easy now," he said, gripping my arms with surprising strength. He steadied me and tilted my chin upward. "What happened to you?" His voice was sharp with disbelief and anger, not at me, but at whatever had done this. I tried to speak again. My voice cracked. "Help, please!" He wasted no time. He wrapped an arm carefully around my back, mindful of the bruising, and guided me toward his house. Inside his brightly lit kitchen, I sank into a chair, trembling from shock and cold. He took one look at my injuries and said he was taking me to the emergency room. I nodded weakly, too exhausted to do anything else. Before he grabbed his keys, he paused and asked the question that lodged itself deep inside my chest. "Where's your family?" I lowered my gaze. I could not answer him, because the truth was too heavy to speak. The bright hospital lights washed over me the moment Mr. Dawson guided me through the sliding doors, making every bruise on my skin feel sharper and more exposed. The cold air inside the emergency room prickled against my damp clothes, sending a shiver that ran from my spine to my fingertips. The ache in my ribs had grown into a deep, pulsing throb, each breath catching like a poorly tuned instrument struggling to resonate. Nurses moved quickly from station to station, their shoes squeaking softly against the polished linoleum floor. The loudspeaker announced codes and patient numbers in a monotone voice that blended into the faint smell of antiseptic and latex gloves. Everything felt distant, muted, like I was trapped behind a foggy pane of glass, watching the world continue without me. Mr. Dawson kept a steadying hand on my shoulder as he explained to the triage nurse that I had fallen and might have a rib injury. His voice was calm, but tinged with urgency. She glanced at me, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the bruising along my jawline, the tender swelling near my collarbone, the faint tremor in my hands. She asked if I could breathe comfortably. I lied and said yes because the truth felt like too much to admit all at once. Within minutes, they had me in a wheelchair and were pushing me down a hallway lined with curtained bays. The wheels clicked softly over a seam in the floor. A nurse with kind eyes leaned down and asked my name, my age, and whether I had any allergies to medication. I answered automatically, each word feeling like it floated away the moment I spoke it. She asked how the injury happened. My breath caught. Images flashed through my mind in broken pieces. Daniel's hand slicing the air, the sharp edge of the table, my mother's voice saying not to make a scene, their footsteps leaving, their laughter drifting away as the house swallowed my silence. I forced my gaze toward the ceiling. "I fell," I said. The nurse paused, not in doubt but in recognition. She had probably heard that same sentence from countless women before me. Her expression softened in a way that made my throat tighten. She did not push me, did not question me. She simply nodded and guided me into the room where a doctor waited with a small tablet in hand. The doctor, a woman with silver hair pulled tightly into a bun, examined me with a gentle thoroughness that made the tenderness in my body flare in both relief and discomfort. She pressed lightly along my ribs, apologizing softly each time I winced. She noted the bruising at my shoulder and the swelling near my hip. She asked if I had hit my head, and I said I was not sure. She asked if I had blacked out, and I hesitated because I did not know what counted as blacking out anymore. She asked again, slower this time. "I think so," I whispered. She wrote something down on her tablet and ordered X-rays. Before they moved me, she asked if there was someone she could call. Family, friend, anyone. The way she asked it made me feel every ounce of my isolation all over again. "No," I said. "There is no one." She paused for a heartbeat longer than before. She looked at me like she wanted to say something but knew she could not. Then she stepped aside as the nurses wheeled me toward radiology. The hallway lights seemed harsher than before, each one passing overhead like a spotlight on everything I did not want to face. The X-ray technician positioned me in front of the machine, adjusting my arms and shoulders with a tenderness that contrasted the stiffness of my body. Each time he asked me to shift, pain rippled across my ribs in jagged waves that made me grit my teeth. "Hold your breath," he said softly. The machine clicked. Exhale. Another click. When it was over, they wheeled me back to the ER bay. Mr. Dawson was waiting outside the curtain, anxiety etched across his face. He did not ask questions. He simply asked if I needed water. I shook my head, afraid that any attempt to speak would unleash something I was not ready to feel. A nurse came in with a small blanket and draped it over me. I had not even realized how cold I was until the warmth settled across my legs. She checked my vitals again, her movements quiet and practiced. She looked at my chart and then at me. "You work in audio," she said, noticing the calluses on my fingertips and the faint pattern of impressions left by years of holding cables and adjusting knobs. I nodded, surprised she could tell. She smiled. "People in your line of work usually care a lot about others. They run toward problems, not away from them." Something inside me cracked at that. For the first time all week, someone saw me. Someone recognized something good in me without twisting it into a flaw. My eyes filled with tears I did not want to shed, and I turned my head slightly so they would slide into my hair instead of down my cheeks. The doctor returned a little while later with the X-ray results. She explained that my ribs were bruised, not fractured, though the impact had been hard enough to create deep tissue bruising. My shoulder was strained but intact. I would need rest ice packs, pain medication, and to avoid lifting anything heavy for several days. As she spoke, I nodded numbly, the clinical information filtering through me like static. Then she looked at me closely, her tone shifting. "Injuries like these can come from falls," she said, "but they can also come from being pushed." I stared at the patterned hospital gown draped over my knees and said nothing. She waited. When I finally lifted my gaze, her expression was filled with a quiet strength that made me want to collapse into the truth. But the words stayed trapped in my throat. I told her again that I fell. She exhaled slowly and did not argue. Instead, she said she wanted to bring in the hospital social worker just to talk. I tensed immediately. "No, please." I said, my voice sharper than intended. "I just want to go home." The doctor tilted her head slightly. She did not lecture me, did not insist. She simply said that the door was open if I changed my mind. When she left, the curtain swayed behind her and the room felt even quieter than before. The nurse returned with discharge instructions and asked if someone was coming to pick me up. Mr. Dawson stepped forward and said he would drive me. The nurse nodded, though I caught the concerned flicker in her eyes. As she left the room, she paused at the curtain and looked back. "If you ever feel unsafe, come back. You do not need permission. You do not need to explain." My throat tightened again. I nodded. She gave a small smile and disappeared down the hallway. After the paperwork was complete and the pain medication had dulled the sharpest edges of my ribs, Mr. Dawson helped me to my feet. I steadied myself against the railing of the bed, breath hitching slightly as the room tilted. He held my elbow, gently guiding me toward the exit. The cold night air outside stung my lungs as we walked to his car. He opened the passenger door for me and waited while I settled into the seat. Before he closed it, he hesitated. His voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "Nora, whatever happened tonight, you did not deserve it." The words landed with a force stronger than any shove, any accusation, any silence I had endured in that house. I blinked back, the tears burning at the corners of my eyes, and nodded once. He closed the door quietly. As we pulled out of the parking lot, the hospital lights receding in the rearview mirror, I stared out the window at the dark stretch of road ahead. The bruises ached, my ribs throbbed, and exhaustion weighed heavy in my bones. But beneath the pain, beneath the fear, beneath the hollow space where my family should have been, a new awareness began to take shape. This was not just a fall. This was the moment everything started to break open. When Mr. Dawson pulled into his driveway, the night had grown colder, the kind of cold that seeped into a person's skin and stayed there. His porch light glowed softly, casting long shadows across the lawn. I could feel every throb in my ribs as he helped me out of the car, my breath catching each time the pain flared. The house next door, my mother's house, sat in silence. No lights on, no movement, No sign that anyone inside cared or even noticed that I had disappeared. I tried not to look at it for too long, but my eyes kept dragging back to the dark windows that once represented family and now only reminded me of abandonment. Inside his kitchen, the warmth wrapped around me in a way that made my knees weaken. He motioned for me to sit while he heated water for tea. The kettle hissed softly, the sound almost comforting against the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I sat stiffly at the small wooden table, pressing my fingertips to the bruised skin along my ribs, wincing as the tenderness pulsed beneath my touch. Mr. Dawson placed a steaming mug in front of me and sat across the table. He did not ask questions right away. He waited, his weathered hands clasped loosely on the table, his expression calm and patient. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "Nora," he said, "I need you to tell me the truth. Did you really fall?" The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words tangled in my throat. I swallowed hard and looked away, staring at the tea swirling in the mug, the steam rising in slow, ghostly ribbons. "I do not want to talk about it," I whispered. He nodded as if he expected that answer. He did not push me. Instead, he stood and crossed to a small drawer near the door. When he returned, he set a small USB drive on the table between us. I stared at it, confused. "I have cameras on my house," he said. "One by the back gate, one facing the side fence, one by the porch." I blinked slowly, my breath catching. I did not understand where he was going with this until he continued. "The sensor lights went on earlier around the time I saw you in the yard. I checked the footage before I left." My heart skipped a beat. My fingers tightened around the mug. He leaned forward slightly. "You need to see what it captured." A cold wave washed through me, leaving a prickling trail down my arms. He stood again and retrieved his laptop from the living room. When he returned, he plugged in the USB and clicked through folders until he found the correct timestamp. The video loaded. At first, the screen was dark, grainy night vision footage showing the side yard between our houses. A faint figure lay on the ground, partially illuminated by the sensor light. Me. I inhaled sharply. In the footage, I was curled on my side, near the grass, holding my ribs, struggling to push myself up. Watching myself like that felt like standing outside my own body, like witnessing a moment I had lived but had not fully processed. Then came the part that stole the breath from my lungs. My family stepped into frame. Daniel walked past first, straightening his jacket, his expression irritated. Brittany followed, adjusting her hair. Her lips curled into a faint smirk as she looked at her reflection in the window. My mother walked last, clutching her purse with both hands as though she were late for something important. They stepped over me. Literally, over me. My mother's heel missed my hand by inches. Daniel glanced down at me with annoyance as though I were an obstacle in his path. Brittany laughed softly at something he said. The audio struggled to catch their voices, but a few words came through clearly. "Do not let her ruin tonight." My mother's voice, sharp, dismissive, final. The three of them walked to their car parked in the driveway. Brittany slipped into the passenger seat. Daniel got behind the wheel. My mother climbed in slowly, still muttering about her knee. The car started. The headlights washed over my body before the car backed out and disappeared down the street. The footage ended with me lying alone in the yard, struggling to breathe. My throat tightened until I could barely swallow. My hands trembled so violently I had to set the mug down before I dropped it. I stared at the dim reflection of the footage on the laptop screen, my breath unsteady, the tears burning behind my eyes, threatening to spill over. The room blurred for a moment as the truth crashed over me again, heavier and more undeniable than before. They saw me. They saw me on the ground. They stepped over me. They left me. Mr. Dawson closed the laptop gently. His expression was unreadable, a mix of anger, disappointment, and sorrow. "Nora," he said softly, "I do not think you fell." I flinched at his words, even though he spoke them with kindness. I pressed both hands to my face, letting the tears finally fall. They streamed down my cheeks, silently pooling at my chin and sinking into the fabric of my sleeves. Everything I had been trying to hold together cracked open in that moment. All the excuses I had made for them. All the times I told myself they cared in their own way. All the times I convinced myself I was the one who needed to change. all of it shattered beneath the unbearable clarity of that video. I felt exposed, ashamed, furious, devastated, and strangely relieved all at once. The truth was terrible, but it was real. And for the first time, the truth was not just something I held alone in my heart. It was visible, something I could show, something undeniable. Mr. Dawson reached across the table and placed his hand gently on mine. "What they did is not normal," he said. "It is not love. You need to protect yourself, Nora. You need distance from them." I shook my head. I do not know how I whispered. He squeezed my hand softly before releasing it. He told me he had copied the footage and wanted me to keep the USB. His eyes were steady when he handed it to me again. "You may need this someday." The weight of the small device in my palm felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained not just video but clarity, proof, reality, evidence of something I had been too afraid to admit. I held it tightly, afraid that letting go would somehow make the truth disappear. I stayed at his house until dawn. My body ached, my ribs throbbed, and fatigue hung over me like a thick blanket. But my mind was sharp, awake. My silence, the silence I had lived under for years, felt suddenly fragile and breakable. When the sun finally crept over the horizon, casting pale light across the neighborhood, I looked toward my mother's house. The curtains were still drawn. The driveway was empty. They were probably still asleep, resting peacefully in the aftermath of their celebration. While I had been in the emergency room bruised and alone, they were toasting Daniel with aged wine and expensive steaks. They did not care where I was. They did not care if I was breathing. The evidence made that painfully clear. Mr. Dawson drove me back to my car at the ER the next morning, insisting I should not walk. I thanked him more times than I could count, though the words felt too small for what he had done. When I slid behind the wheel of my own car, the morning sun warming the windshield, I held the USB tightly in my hand. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of something inside me. Not anger, not revenge. Something quieter, stronger. A new awareness born from truth and pain and survival. I had evidence now. Evidence that they were willing to step over me. Evidence that I mattered so little to them that they left me on the ground without a backward glance. And I knew, even in that fragile morning light, that this evidence was going to change everything. I spent the next 48 hours drifting between exhaustion and a strange electric clarity, the kind that only comes when an old truth finally rips itself free from the shadows you have buried it in. My ribs still ached every time I inhaled too deeply, and the bruises along my shoulder had begun to bloom into rich shades of purple and green. But the physical pain felt almost distant compared to the sharp, pulsing awareness inside me. The USB stayed in my pocket the entire time, its small rectangular weight grounding me each time fear or doubt tried to pull me back into silence. I knew what I needed to do, even though the thought of it made my heartbeat stutter. For years, I had let my family control the narrative. I had let them frame me as dramatic, unstable, overly sensitive, difficult, ungrateful. I had swallowed all the little stories they spun around me until they became truths, even in my own mind. But the footage shattered that illusion, and once shattered, it could never be pieced back into the tidy picture they liked to present to the world. I drove to the theater the following afternoon, my side still tender when I turned the wheel. The building was quiet since it was a weekday, only a few staff wandering through the hallways preparing for an upcoming performance. When I stepped into the tech room where the projection system was stored, my supervisor Mark glanced up from the equipment rack. He was a broad-shouldered man with a soft voice and the kind of steady presence that made chaos feel manageable. "You look like you got hit by a truck," he said, his eyebrows lifting as he took in the bruises on my face. I hesitated. The old instinct to deflect, minimize, explain away, rose quickly. But then I remembered the footage. I remembered the way my mother stepped over me without even looking down. I remembered the way Daniel laughed before getting into the car. I took a steadying breath. "Something happened at my family's house," I said quietly. "I think I need your help." Mark did not ask questions right away. Instead, he motioned toward the projector. "What do you need?" His simple trust nearly unspooled me. I removed the USB from my pocket and handed it to him. "I need to play this on a large screen," I said, "at a venue. Tomorrow night. Somewhere public." Mark nodded slowly and inserted the USB into his laptop. I stepped back, bracing myself for his reaction. The footage played. I watched his face instead of the screen. The moment he saw me lying in the dirt, his jaw clenched. When my family stepped over me, a shadow crossed his expression. When my mother's voice came through the speaker advising them not to let me ruin the night, Mark inhaled sharply. He paused the video and closed the laptop with deliberate care. "Where do you want to show this?" he asked. "Daniel's company is hosting a celebration dinner tomorrow night at the Portland Regency Ballroom," I said. "Everyone will be there. His colleagues, his boss, his investors. It is the perfect place." Mark did not hesitate. "I can have a portable projector ready by morning. I can set it up in 10 seconds if needed." "Are you sure you want to do this?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I pressed my hand to my ribs, feeling the dull ache beneath my fingers. "Yes." The next evening arrived faster than I expected. My nerves buzzed beneath my skin as I dressed, choosing a simple outfit that covered most of my bruises but not all. I wanted them visible. I wanted them unmistakable. I wanted them to tell their own story. The Regency Ballroom glowed with warm, golden lights when I arrived, the kind used by hotels trying to elevate corporate events into something that felt more like prestige than performance. Through the glass doors, I could see the catered buffet, the clusters of well-dressed professionals mingling with drinks in hand, the balloon arch marking Daniel's latest achievement. He was getting rewarded, celebrated, toasted, all while I lay in an emergency room wondering if I even mattered to the people who shared my blood. I inhaled and counted slowly to steady myself. Mark stood beside me, a discreet black equipment case in his hand. "Ready when you are," he murmured. We pushed through the doors. The music was soft jazz, the kind meant to blend into the background. Conversation drifted through the air like static. I spotted Daniel immediately. He stood near the stage in a crisp suit, gesturing broadly as he spoke to his supervisor. His laugh carried easily across the room. When he saw me, his face twisted. "Seriously," he hissed, striding up to me. "What are you doing here? You are not invited." I held his gaze, my fingers tightening around my phone. "I came to congratulate you," I said, my voice steady. He scoffed, eyes sweeping over the faint bruises visible on my skin. "Oh God, do not start. I am not doing this tonight. You always make everything about you." People around us began to quiet their conversations, fading as heads turned. I could feel the shift in the air, the subtle ripple of attention. Perfect timing. I nodded at Mark. He moved toward the small stage with practiced ease, opening the equipment case and setting up the projector. Daniel noticed. "What is that?" he snapped. "What are you doing?" His voice grew sharper, louder, drawing more eyes. I stepped toward the stage. "Just showing everyone something important," I said. Before he could stop me, the projector flickered to life. The footage appeared on the ballroom's backdrop screen in stark clarity. Me lying in the yard, my hands clutching my ribs, my breath shallow and unsteady. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. The video continued. My mother stepped over me, then Brittany, then Daniel. Their laughter carried clearly through the speakers. "Do not let her ruin tonight," someone whispered. "Oh my God," someone else murmured. "Is that his sister?" Daniel lunged toward the projector, but Mark stepped smoothly in front of him. "Touch it and you will prove every second of this video right," Mark warned quietly. Daniel froze. The footage ended. Silence swallowed the room. Thick, heavy, absolute. Daniel's supervisor stepped forward slowly, his expression tight. "Daniel," he said, "I need a word with you. Now." The two of them moved toward a quiet corner of the ballroom. Daniel kept glancing back at me, his face pale, his jaw locked in a tight clench. Brittany hurried after him, whispering frantic explanations. People around the room murmured to one another, the judgment unmistakable. He left her on the ground. He stepped over her. She was injured. She could have died. My mother stood near the entrance, frozen in place, her hand clutching her purse so tightly, her knuckles had turned white. I walked past her. For once, she did not speak. Mark placed a hand on my shoulder as the ballroom buzzed with shock whispers, outrage. "You did it," he said softly. "No," I said, lifting my chin. I showed the truth. it did the rest on its own. Behind me, Daniel's supervisor raised his voice slightly. "Daniel, your conduct raises serious concerns. We will be suspending you until further notice pending an internal review." The words hit the room like a dropped glass. Daniel sputtered some kind of protest, but it did not matter. The consequences had begun, and for the first time in my life, they were not falling on me. They were falling on the people who had earned them. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights shimmering across the pavement. My bruises still ached. My ribs still hurt. But something inside me felt lighter than it had in years. I had not come for revenge. I had come for truth. And tonight, the truth had finally spoken louder than my family ever had. When I stepped out of the Regency ballroom, the cool Portland night hit my face like a baptism, washing away the final remnants of the fear that had held me hostage for years. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, their glow forming small halos on the ground. I had expected to feel triumphant, angry, vindicated, or even shaken, but instead I felt strangely hollow, as though I had finally reached the end of a long and brutal climb, only to find myself staring at a view I had never imagined. Behind me, the ballroom buzzed in chaos. Even through the glass doors, I could hear the strained voices, the hurried footsteps, the muted commotion of a celebration collapsing in on itself. Daniel's downfall had begun the moment the screen lit up. I had known it would be bad for him, but I had not anticipated just how rapidly the consequences would fall. 20 minutes after the video played, his company circulated a quiet internal announcement. Daniel Ellison would be placed on immediate leave while the firm conducted a formal review into allegations of unethical conduct and severe personal misconduct. In an industry obsessed with public image, that kind of wording was almost always a prelude to termination. The news spread across the event like smoke. By the time I reached my car, fragments of whispered conversations drifted toward me, carried by the cool night breeze. "Did you see how he stepped over her? That is not normal." His sister could barely move. He laughed. "That is not a family." My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked the car. Part of me expected to feel guilty. Another part braced for that familiar internal voice telling me I had gone too far. But nothing came. Just silence. Just truth. The next morning, my phone erupted. Missed calls from my mother stacked endlessly. Texts from Daniel ranged from furious to pleading. At 8 in the morning, Brittany sent a single message. "You destroyed our lives." I stared at the screen for a full minute before placing the phone face down on the counter. I was not going to let their chaos pull me back in. I showered, dressed slowly, and walked into my small kitchen where the sunlight filtered through the blinds and painted narrow stripes across the counter. For the first time in years, I felt no impulse to brace myself for my family's reactions. By noon, the fallout began unfolding publicly. Someone from the ballroom had posted a vague comment online about an executive being suspended after shocking behavior surfaced at a company event. No names were mentioned, but Portland was a small enough professional network that people connected the dots easily. By 3 in the afternoon, an internal memo leaked. It did not mention the video only that Daniel's behavior was under review for failing to provide aid to a family member in distress and for knowingly abandoning her while injured. That was enough to ignite speculation. That evening, as I sat curled on my couch with a heating pad pressed to my ribs, Mark texted me a screenshot. A local business forum had begun discussing the situation. One user wrote that stepping over an injured woman was not just unethical, but reprehensible. Another commented that leadership positions required empathy and responsibility, not entitlement and cruelty. A third pointed out that anyone willing to leave an injured sibling on the ground could not be trusted with a team, a client, or even basic human decency. The thread grew rapidly. I did not comment. I did not need to. Truth travels without permission. Meanwhile, Brittany faced her own unraveling. Her employer contacted her after learning she had used Daniel's corporate expense privileges to purchase personal items. The company had overlooked it once, labeling it a misunderstanding, but with Daniel suspended, they reviewed every charge. By the next morning, Brittany's work badge was deactivated. Security escorted her out of the building. My mother faced consequences of an entirely different kind. Her world revolved around her church community, a group that prized charity, compassion, and integrity. The footage reached them through whispered channels. Though they would never openly shame her, their distance spoke louder than words. Invitations disappeared. Messages stopped. People who once ran toward her with bright smiles now paused, searching for an excuse to walk in the opposite direction. That weekend, I went to the grocery store near her house and saw her leaving the parking lot. She did not see me. She looked smaller somehow, her posture curved inward, her expression tight with worry. For the first time, I realized she was afraid. Not of the truth, but of being seen in the truth. They wanted to control everything, including perception, and the moment that perception shattered their world cracked open. The most surprising part was how quickly they turned on each other. On Sunday night, my mother called. I let it ring 4 times before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to breathe in the silence for a few seconds longer. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "How could you do this to your brother? He is falling apart. His job is gone. His reputation is ruined. You humiliated him in front of everyone." My hand tightened around the phone. I had expected anger. I had expected denial. I had not expected fear. "I did not ruin his reputation," I said. "He did." She exhaled sharply as though the words cut her. "You should have handled this privately. Family matters remain inside the family." That sentence hit like a flash grenade. It was the very belief that had kept me trapped for years, the belief that had allowed them to conceal wrongdoing as disciplined cruelty, as concerned silence as loyalty. I responded calmly, my voice steady. Family does not step over a daughter lying injured on the ground. Family does not leave someone behind because she is inconvenient. Family does not protect silence more than safety. She did not reply. I heard a faint hitch in her breath followed by a strained whisper. "Daniel said he did not see you." The footage showed otherwise. Then she tried another tactic. "You embarrassed us. People at church are talking." This time I felt no anger, only clarity. "I did not embarrass you," I said. "You embarrassed yourselves." The silence that followed felt like the closing of a door. The next day, Daniel tried calling 8 times in a row. On the 9th attempt, he left a voicemail. "Nora, listen," he said, his tone strained. "I do not remember stepping over you. Everything was chaotic. You know how Brittany gets. You know how Mom gets. This is a misunderstanding. You made it worse. You made it public. You need to come down to the office and talk to HR. Help me fix this." My breath caught, not because his words hurt, but because they were so predictable. I replayed the voicemail twice, then deleted it. I had spent my entire life contorting myself to fit into their fragile narrative, twisting truth, minimizing harm, absorbing blame. Not anymore. The truth had already done what truth does. It exposed. It illuminated. It drew sharp, unforgiving lines between who they pretended to be and who they were. The aftermath continued growing in ways none of them could control. By midweek, Daniel's LinkedIn account went silent. He removed his job title. His profile picture disappeared. Brittany posted a vague message about betrayal. My mother stopped updating her church group entirely. Meanwhile, the world outside their bubble continued moving forward as though nothing unusual had occurred. Neighbors walked dogs. Children played basketball in driveways. People bought flowers at the local market. Life continued. And for the first time, mine continued too. Not under their shadow. Not beneath their expectations, not inside their narrative, but out in the open air where truth breathed freely and consequences followed the right people. Daniel had always been the golden child, the cherished one, the future legacy of the Ellison family name. But legacies built on silence do not survive the light. The morning after Daniel's voicemail, I woke up before sunrise. The sky outside my window still washed in shades of deep indigo. For the first time in years, I did not feel the heaviness of dread pressing against my chest. I lay still for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the heater and the faint rustle of leaves outside. My ribs still ached, but the pain no longer scared me. It reminded me that I had survived something I was never meant to survive. As light slowly seeped into the room, I felt a clarity settling over me, quiet but steady. I needed to leave Portland. Not because I was running away, but because I was finally strong enough to walk towards something instead of away from something. I packed my bags, slowly folding clothes with deliberate care. Each item I placed into the suitcase felt like a small shedding of the life I was leaving behind. The apartment had been my refuge for years, yet it had never felt like home. It had always been too close to my mother's world, too close to the emotional gravity that pulled me in and crushed me over and over. When I zipped the suitcase shut, I felt something inside me click into place. A quiet, resolute decision. I called the theater first. Mark answered on the second ring. I need to take some time off, I told him. I might not come back. There was a pause before he spoke. I figured as much. Where are you going? I exhaled, letting the truth spill out. I have been thinking about Astoria. The small coastal theater there is hiring a sound engineer for their spring season. Mark's voice softened. That sounds like a good place to start. You deserve something gentle. I thanked him, my voice thick with emotion. His support had been one of the few things that had kept me from falling apart completely. As I loaded my suitcase into the trunk of my car, the morning sun lifted slowly above the rooftops, casting long golden beams across the street. It felt like a quiet blessing, a permission to begin again. The drive to Astoria took a few hours. The road curved along stretches of evergreen forests, the trees rising tall and strong like silent guardians. Each mile that passed loosened something tight inside me. By the time the Columbia River came into view, shimmering under the soft light, I felt like I had shed an entire lifetime's worth of weight. Astoria greeted me with salty air seagulls calling in the distance, and the faint sound of waves hitting the shore. The small coastal town felt nothing like Portland. It was gentler, slower, more human. The theater was small but charming, seated near the edge of town with a weathered brick exterior and string lights draped along its entrance. When I stepped inside, the faint smell of sawdust paint and ocean air made my heart ache in a way I could not quite explain. It felt like a place that understood rebuilding. The artistic director, a kind woman named Harper with curly auburn hair and paint smudges on her sleeves, greeted me with a wide smile. I told her I was here to interview for the position. She glanced at the bruises still faintly visible along my neck, but did not ask a single intrusive question. Instead, she said, "We could use someone who knows how to make things sound honest." She showed me the sound booth, a compact space filled with consoles, faders, and old equipment that had clearly seen better days. When I ran my fingers across the hover of dials, something inside me settled. This is what I was meant to do. This was where I could rebuild. Harper offered me the job on the spot. I accepted without hesitation. Over the next week, I settled into a small rental cottage near the water. The cottage was old but warm, with a creaky front porch and a view of the river that changed colors with every hour of the day. At night, I left the window cracked so I could fall asleep to the sound of waves. I began working at the theater almost immediately. The cast welcomed me into their tiny but passionate community. They had no idea who I was or what I had endured, and for the first time in my life, that anonymity felt beautiful. I was not the forgotten daughter or the inconvenient sister. I was simply Nora, the new sound engineer. I spent my days adjusting mic levels, editing audio tracks, and repairing equipment with steady hands. Each task grounded me. Each small act reminded me that I was capable, skilled, valuable. On my lunch breaks, I walked to the pier with a sandwich and watched the fishing boats drift in and out. The scent of salt water mixed with warm bread felt like a reminder that simple moments could be healing. I made friends slowly at first, then more easily as the days passed. A lighting technician named Sophia brought me coffee every morning. A stagehand named Jonah taught me how to tie proper nautical knots because he said every coastal resident should know how. For the first time in years, I laughed. I breathed. I slept through the night without waking from nightmares. I started physical therapy for my ribs at a small clinic near town. The therapist, a soft-spoken man named Lucas, encouraged me to be patient with my recovery. "Healing takes time," he said, "not just bones, everything." And he was right. My bones mended slowly. So did the parts of me I had forgotten to take care of. One evening after a long rehearsal, I walked down to the water and sat on the weathered wooden steps leading to the river's edge. The wind brushed lightly through my hair, carrying the sound of distant waves. For the first time, I whispered the truth aloud. I am okay now. And as the sky deepened into shades of lavender and gold, I believed it. The darkness I had lived under for so long had begun to lift. I was rising from it slowly but surely, one breath at a time. It was nearly 3 months into my new life in Astoria when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I had just finished adjusting ambient sound cues for the upcoming spring performance and was walking out of the theater into the cool evening air. The sky was streaked with orange and lilac hues, the kind of quiet sunset that made the entire town feel suspended in gentle stillness. I paused outside the entrance, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I checked the message. Nora, we need to talk. It is about Daniel. Please meet us in Portland tomorrow. It was signed simply Mom. No apology, no concern, no acknowledgement of the months of silence, just expectation as if nothing had changed. I stared at the message for a long moment before slipping the phone into my pocket. The old version of myself would have reacted instantly, heart pounding, mind spiraling, wondering what I had done wrong. But now the fear had thinned, replaced with something steadier. Clarity. The next morning, I drove back to Portland. The familiar skyline came into view like a ghost from another lifetime. I made the trip not out of obligation, but because I wanted closure. Not their version. Mine. They chose a neutral meeting place, a small cafe near downtown. When I stepped inside, I spotted them immediately. My mother sat stiffly at the table, her purse clutched tightly against her chest. Daniel sat beside her, his eyes tired, dark circles forming beneath them. Brittany hovered slightly behind, chewing nervously on her lip. They looked smaller than I remembered. Worn, frayed, not powerful, not intimidating. Just people dealing with the consequences they had earned. When they saw me approach, my mother straightened, smoothing her blouse with shaking hands. Nora, thank you for coming, she said, as though addressing a stranger. I nodded but remained silent as I pulled out the chair across from them. Daniel cleared his throat. He looked like he had aged years in a matter of weeks. I lost my job, he began. HR said I violated the company's code of conduct. They said I showed a pattern of concerning behavior. He paused, waiting for sympathy. None came. Brittany jumped in quickly. And people online are talking. You did not have to show that video. There were other ways. My mother gave me a tight, strained smile. We forgive you, she announced softly, as though expecting praise for her generosity. You have always been emotional, Nora. You overreact. But we want to put this behind us and rebuild as a family. I let the words settle in the air. The audacity of pretending they were offering me something. The quiet assumption that forgiveness flowed downward. They did not want reconciliation. They wanted control. Again, I folded my hands on the table, my voice calm. I am not here for forgiveness. My mother blinked. Confusion flickered across her face. I continued before she could speak. I am here for closure. Real closure. Daniel's gaze sharpened. What does that mean? It means acknowledging what happened, I said. Not rewriting it, not minimizing it. The truth is that you stepped over me while I was hurt. You left me on the ground. You went to dinner. You celebrated. And none of you called. My mother recoiled slightly, her mouth tightening. We did not know you were that hurt. The footage says otherwise. Silence spread across the table like spilled ink. Daniel stared at his hands. Brittany looked away. My mother tried again, her voice rising slightly. Families make mistakes. We can move past this. We can be close again. I took a slow breath. I thought about the theater in Astoria, the quiet mornings near the river, the friends who treated me with kindness without expecting anything in return. I thought about the peace that had begun settling in my bones. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. I am building a life that does not revolve around being hurt and then forgiving the people who hurt me. Their faces shifted from confusion to panic to something like desperation. Nora, do not do this, Daniel said, his voice cracking. You are my sister. I met his gaze steadily. And you abandoned me. Not years ago, not once, but every time it mattered. I reached into my bag and placed the USB on the table. It clicked softly against the wood. "This is yours," I said. "I do not need it anymore." Their eyes widened. They had expected weaponry. They had expected ammunition. Instead, I was giving them the truth back, no longer mine to carry. I stepped away from the table. My mother stood quickly, reaching out as if to grab my arm. "Please do not leave like this." I paused just long enough to deliver the only words I had left for them. Family is not the people who step over you when you fall. It is the people who come running. I walked out of the cafe before she could respond. Outside, the air smelled like rain. The city moved around me in a blur of noise and life, but for once, none of it pressed against me. I felt light, untethered, whole. When I returned to Astoria that evening, the theater lights glowed warmly against the deepening dusk. I slipped into the sound booth and adjusted the microphone on the main stage for the rehearsal starting the next morning. My bruises had faded. My ribs had nearly healed. And as I stood there in the soft golden light, I knew I had found what I had been searching for all along. Not forgiveness, not revenge, but freedom. If you watched this story all the way until the end, I want to speak directly to you now, because this part is not just for entertainment. It is for every single person who has ever been ignored, dismissed, or stepped over by the people who claimed to love them. And I know many of you watching, especially those in the United States, who grew up in families where silence was treated as loyalty and suffering was treated as duty, will understand this more deeply than you ever should have had to. Maybe you know exactly what it feels like to give everything to a family that gives nothing back. Maybe you know what it is like to be the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who holds everything together while the golden child gets praised for simply breathing. Maybe you know what it is like to lie in a hospital bed wondering if anyone will show up. Maybe you know what it is like to sit alone on a holiday while your family celebrates somewhere else without you telling themselves you are the problem. If any part of Nora's story felt familiar, you are not alone and you are not imagining it. People from all over the country, from small towns in the Midwest to busy cities on the East Coast, write to this channel every day with stories just like this. Stories of parents who protected the wrong child. Stories of siblings who weaponized silence. Stories of adult children who had to rebuild their lives from scratch because walking away from family was the only way to survive. And if that is you, I want you to know this. Your pain is real. Your truth matters, and your healing does not require anyone's permission. You do not need your family to admit what they did. You do not need their apology to grow. You do not need their approval to start over. Sometimes the most powerful step you can take is stepping out of the narrative they forced you into. If you are watching this from your living room after a long shift, or from a quiet bedroom where you finally have space to breathe, or from your car because that is the only place you can find a moment of peace, I hope Nora's story reminds you that choosing yourself is not selfish. It is survival. And for those of you who have walked through years of emotional exhaustion, who have lived through bruises both visible and invisible, who kept moving forward even when no one came running, when you fell, you deserve the life you are building now. You deserve peace, safety, friendships that lift you up, love that does not demand your silence, and a future that does not look like your past. And if you are still in the middle of that journey, still rebuilding your confidence, still learning how to speak your truth without shaking, stay with this channel. Stories like this are not just entertainment. They are reminders. They are mirrors. They are permission slips for anyone who needed someone else to say, "You are not crazy. You are not overreacting. You are not alone." Before you go, I want to ask you the question I always ask at the end of the most personal stories on this channel, because your words might be the one thing someone else needs to hear tonight. Where are you watching from, and what part of Nora's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the moment she realized no one was coming? Was it the footage that proved the truth she had been gaslit out of for years? Was it the quiet strength she found when she walked away? Share it in the comments. You never know who might read your words and finally feel understood. And if you have a story of your own, whether it is about family betrayal, emotional neglect, being the scapegoat, or finding the courage to leave a toxic home, you can share it too. This community is filled with people who have survived the unthinkable, and your voice might help someone else survive their chapter. If you want more stories like this, stories of justice, healing, empowerment, and truth, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. New stories drop every week, and each one is crafted with the same care, the same emotional depth, and the same promise you will never feel alone here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. And wherever you are tonight, I hope you are safe. I hope you are healing. And I hope you know you deserve a life that never asks you to shrink again.